The laugh started at the back of the tent and worked its way forward the way a laugh does when everybody wants to be in on it, and by the time it reached the front row, the auctioneer had already dropped lot 6111 twice, because a man near the ring had just announced that somebody had hacked a slot clean through the jaw of it. It was a wrench. That was the whole description on the sale bill, 4 words long. Steel wrench, sold where is. It was lying in the wet grass at the far end of a spring consignment sale at the fairgrounds outside Coshocton, Ohio, on the 13th of April, 2024, between a row of hydraulic cylinders and a pallet of chain, and it was 19 feet long. The jaw at the business end of it was open 34 inches across the flats, wide enough that a grown man could have sat down in it. The shank behind the jaw was 11 inches thick one way and 7 inches the other, and the whole thing weighed 12,340 pounds on the certified scale at the co-op elevator 2 miles down the road, which is 6 tons. Say the word wrench to anybody in that tent, and they pictured the same thing you just did. Something in a drawer, something you carry in one hand and lose in the truck. That is why the laugh went the way it did, and why the auctioneer had to keep coming down. He opened it at $400. Nobody moved. He came to $200, then $100. A fellow in a seed cap said something about a hardware store sign and got the second laugh of the afternoon, and by then everybody in the tent had decided what the thing was: a prop. An advertising novelty off a roof somewhere. A joke somebody welded up for a parade float and got tired of. The scrap men had already done the only arithmetic that mattered to them. Prepared steel that week ran about $141 a ton delivered to the mill. 6 tons comes to roughly $846. But a solid alloy forging 11 inches through does not fit a shear, and cutting it into mill lengths meant a torch, 2 men, most of a day and a set of rigging. Denny Reese, who buys most of the iron at that sale, had it figured at about $900 to turn it into $846. That is why nothing happened at $100. The lot was worth less than nothing, and everybody there knew it. Wade Toiver bid $75, and the tent laughed at him. He is 58 years old, he is a millwright, and he has spent 34 years setting and pulling heavy rotating equipment in powerhouses, pump stations, and paper mills. He owns a shop with 2 employees outside Warsaw, Ohio. He did not bid because he liked old iron. He bid because of 3 things he could see from where he stood that nobody else in the tent walked over to look at. The first was that it was one piece, not plate cut on a table and welded up into the shape of a wrench, which is how you would build one today and how you would build one for a parade float. The grain of the steel ran out of the shank and around the throat of the jaw in one continuous sweep, the way metal only moves when it has been beaten into shape hot under a hammer. He ran his thumb around the inside of that curve, and there was nothing to feel. The second was the inside of the jaw. Both flats were rusty, but on one of them, back near the throat. A patch about the size of a dinner plate was worn bright and slightly hollow, polished the way steel only gets when other steel has been pressed against it under enormous force over and over for years. The opposite flat had nothing. That is a tool that turned one way on one thing for a very long time. The third was the tail. Forged into the far end of the handle, 19 feet from the jaw, was a closed eye about 4 inches across, and it was not round. A chain had pulled it oval, and the oval ran in exactly the direction that matched the polished flat. None of that told him what it was, and he would like people to know it. If you had asked him standing there in the grass, with his hand in the jaw, he could not have told you what machine on this earth carries a nut 34 inches across the flats. He only knew that somebody had gone to a tremendous amount of trouble to make a hand tool the size of a utility pole, and that people do not do that for fun. Loading it took 2 hours and cost him more than the wrench did. He came back the next morning with a boom truck and a friend with a skid loader and dragged it onto rollers and then onto a flatbed with a chain and a snatch block. He paid the gate $75. He paid a man $180 to help him, and he went home with a 6-ton wrench in his yard and no idea what to do with it. If you've made it this far into Wade's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Here is what it was. In 1913, if you built water turbines in this country, you did not just ship the machine. You shipped the machine and you shipped the tools that opened it, because there was no telephone worth using and no air freight at all, and the place the machine was going might be 3 weeks from the nearest railhead. And the tool that mattered most was the one that came off the shaft. On a big impulse water wheel, the runner, the wheel itself, the part the water hits, sits on the end of a forged steel shaft and is held there by a single nut. One nut. Everything the machine does, every horsepower it makes for 50 or 80 or 100 years is carried by that one threaded joint. So the nut is enormous, it is fitted, it is usually a left-hand thread so that the machine's own rotation tightens it instead of loosening it. And it is torqued down to a figure that no man can produce with his arms. And because it is enormous and fitted and left-handed, exactly one tool on earth will take it off without destroying it, and the works that built the machine made that tool by hand and sent it along in the crate. The one lying in the grass at Cossacton had been made by a forge and machine works in Massillon, Ohio, in 1913. It came out of the yard of a heavy hauling outfit that had gone under in 2019, and the hauling outfit had taken it in 1961 as part of a load of scrap collateral when the forge closed, and it had lain in their yard for 63 years because it was too awkward to cut and too heavy to steel. For part of that time, it had been used as a skid, laid across a soft spot in the yard so loaded trailers could roll over it without sinking. There are still ruts across the shank. The forge built 5 of them off the same print. 4 went out with machines. 1 stayed at the works as the master, which is the one that survived, because a master never goes anywhere and nothing ever happens to it. Now, the reason a story like this exists at all is that in April of 2024, Wade Toiver did the single most ordinary thing a person can do with something they do not understand. He took 6 photographs of it with his phone, the jaw, the throat, the slot, the polished flat, the oval eye, and the stamping, and he put them on an old machinery form with 4 words of his own. What is this? He got 11 replies in a day. 9 of them were guesses. The 10th was a retired turbine field engineer named Neil Prather, 79 years old, sitting in a kitchen in Idaho, who had spent his working life crawling into wheel pits and who did not guess. He wrote back with 5 questions and asked Wade to answer them in order with a tape measure and to take his time. 1. How many inches across the flats, measured at the very back of the jaw, not at the mouth? 2. How deep is the jaw from the mouth to the throat? 3. There is a slot through the back of the jaw. Is the slot parallel-sided, or is it tapered? And if it is tapered, how much narrower is it at one end than the other? 4. Overall length, tip to eye. 5. What does it weigh, and is that a guess or a ticket? The answers came back the same evening. 34 inches, 26 inches. Tapered 3/8 of an inch of taper over 14, 19 feet even. 12,340 pounds, and it is a ticket, and here is a photograph of the ticket. Prather did not reply for 2 days. When he did not tell Wade what he had. He told Wade what to do with it, which was to leave it exactly where it was, not to wire brush it, not to paint it, and above all, not to touch the slot. I want to stop here and give you 3 things, because a lot of you watch these sales, and one of these things is going to come back before this is over. If you ever find yourself standing in a sale ring in front of a big forged tool that nobody wants, look at 3 places, in this order. Look at the throat first, the inside curve where the jaw meets the handle. Run your hand around it. If it is one piece, the metal will be continuous and slightly uneven, like a muscle. If somebody built it out of plate, there is a weld seam in that curve, and it will be the straightest, most regular line anywhere on the tool. That seam is not decoration. It is where it will open up. Look at the flats inside the jaw second. A tool that has worked is bright in one small place and rusty everywhere else. A tool that is hung on a wall is evenly rusty all over or evenly painted, and it will look better than the working one, and it is worth less. Look at the pull-eye third. Round is bad. Round means nothing ever pulled hard enough on it to matter. You want an eye that has been drawn out of round, and you want the long axis of that oval to line up with the wear in the jaw, because that tells you the tool was pulled in the same direction it gripped, which means the 2 ends agree with each other, which means it is what it says it is. Remember the first one, the seam in the throat. Some 4,000 miles south of that fairground, at 10,900 feet in the central Andes of Peru, there is a stone powerhouse on a river called the Rumipata that was finished in 1913 and has been running ever since. 2 horizontal impulse units, water brought down 1,100 feet of mountain in a steel pipe, and the whole thing built by a company that no longer exists, out of parts that no longer exist, for a valley that had nothing before it and would have nothing after it. Unit 1 died in 2011 and was stripped to keep Unit 2 alive. In February of 2024, Unit 2 threw a bucket off its runner at speed, and the machine came apart inside its own housing loudly enough to be heard in the village below. The valley that station carries is 31,000 people in 9 villages, a hospital with 40 beds, a water treatment plant, and 2 schools. The national grid is 160 miles away over a mountain range and has been 4 years from arriving for about 30 years. From February of 2024, those 31,000 people ran on rented diesel sets trucked up the switchbacks at a cost to the utility of roughly $96,000 a month over what the river had been giving them for free. To fix Unit 2, you have to take the runner off the shaft. To take the runner off the shaft, you have to remove 1 nut 34 inches across the flats, left-hand thread, last loosened in 1968 by 4 men, and the tool that came in the crate in 1913. The tool that came in the crate burned with the old workshop roof in 1962. The jefe de mantenimiento at Rumipata is a man named Aurelio Vargas, 51, who has worked at that station for 26 years, and whose father worked there before him. In March of 2024, he had a wrench fabricated in Lima, cut out a 4-inch plate, and welded up to the dimensions off the 1913 general arrangement drawing that hangs in the station office. It was the sensible thing to do. It cost him 5 weeks, and it looked exactly right. On the second pull, it opened up. Plate wrenches do not fail by breaking, they fail by spreading, the jaw flexing open a few thousandths under load until it stops touching the flats of the nut and starts riding on the corners. It rounded 2 of the 6 corners off that nut before they stopped. You get 6 corners. That is the whole supply. Every attempt after that has fewer places to grip. Hydraulic torque tools were the next idea, and they died on a tape measure. There are 19 inches of clearance between the nut and the pit wall, and the reaction arm alone needed 27. Cutting the nut off was raised and dropped in one meeting, because the thread underneath it is the end of a single forged shaft from 1913, and a new shaft was quoted at $610,000. 40 weeks. And a road that will not carry it. Having a new wrench forged was priced by 3 shops on 2 continents. The fastest said 34 weeks. Aurelio Vargas had been posting the same request on the same old machinery forum since 2021 in careful English about once a year and getting nothing. On the 2nd of June 2024, somebody sent him a link to a thread containing 6 photographs and 4 words. Now let me tell you about the slot, because everything turns on it, and because in April of 2024 an entire auction tent looked straight at it and decided it was damage. Cut through the back of the jaw, behind where the nut sits, there is a rectangular slot, and the slot is tapered 3/8 of an inch narrower at one end than the other over its 14 inches of length. It is not a repair. It is not a chisel mark. It is a key seat, and it is the entire reason the tool exists in the form it does. Here is how a wrench that big is actually used. You slide the jaw over the nut, which is a loose fit because it has to be. Then you drive a hardened steel key into that tapered slot behind the far flat of the nut with a sledge. The key wedges. It pushes the nut hard back against the opposite face of the jaw, and now the wrench is not resting on the nut, it is clamped to it, flat to flat, across the full 26 inches of jaw depth. When you pull on the handle, the load goes into the middle of 2 flats instead of into 6 corners, and the corners never know anything happened. That is the difference between a tool that opens a nut and a tool that eats one. The lemur wrench was strong. It just had nothing holding it in contact. Wade never had the original key. Nobody has. He made one in his own shop in a day. Out of a piece of 4140 he had standing in the rack, cut to the taper he had measured with a feeler gauge, and a straight-edge back when a retired engineer in Idaho asked him question 3 and told him to take his time. And the polished patch on one flat, the one about the size of a dinner plate, back near the throat. That is precisely where a nut lands when the key is driven. One flat and not the other, because the thread is left-handed and there is only one direction that nut has ever needed to go. The agreement was signed on the 19th of July, 2024. The utility would pay $118,000 for the wrench, a hardened key, a certified proof load test, a steel shipping crate, and Wade Toiver in the wheel pit with it. It is not a collector's price, and it was never meant to be one. Set it against $96,000 a month, and it is 5 weeks of diesel. He spent $14,600 of his own money in the next 3 weeks. A crate, marine insurance, oversized road permits for the run to Baltimore. 2 days of a testing house's time to pull the wrench to 1.4 times its working load with strain gauges on the throat, which it passed without moving a thousandth, a passport he had never needed before. Then, 9 days before it was due on the truck, the utility canceled. A machinery museum in western Pennsylvania had come forward with an identical wrench hanging on a wall in their forging hall, cataloged as an original tool by the same Ohio works. They offered to lend it for the cost of freight. A board that had been bleeding $96,000 a month for 6 months looked at $118,000 looked at freight only, and made the decision anybody would have made. Wade Toiver got a short, apologetic, entirely reasonable email and $14,600 gone and a 6-ton wrench in his yard again. The museum's wrench arrived at Rumapata on the 21st of October, 2024. There are photographs of it going up the switchbacks, and men are smiling in all of them. It failed on the first pull. It did not spread slowly the way the Lima one had. The throat opened, the jaw came off the flats, and it took a third corner off the nut. When they got it into the light and looked at the inside of the curve where the jaw meets the handle, there was a weld seam running through it. Straight and regular and beautifully ground. The museum's own file, when somebody finally went and read it, said the piece had been built in 1974 by a fabricating shop for an exhibit about the works. From photographs, at a quarter of the cost of moving, a real one. It had hung on that wall for 50 years being an original tool because nobody had ever needed it to be anything else. 3 corners left. The wet season had closed the road. The next window was May. Aurelio Vargas called Ohio on the 4th of November 2024. He has said since that he was prepared to be told any number at all and to pay it, and that he had already worked out what he would say to the board. The price was $118,000, the same as July. Wade Toiver has been asked about that more than about anything else in this story, and his answer has never varied. He had put a number on the tool in July, and nothing about the tool had changed since July. It shipped on the 11th of February, 2025, in a steel crate stenciled with the only number that had ever belonged to it, which was the lot number off an Ohio sale bill 6111. Baltimore to Callao by sea, 3 weeks on the water, 10 days in customs. Then 290 miles inland and 10,900 feet up on a lowboy with a pusher truck behind it, over a road with 14 switchbacks where the trailer had to be backed and retaken, and the last mile on rollers and timber because the bridge below the powerhouse is rated at 8 tons. They set it in the wheel pit on the 19th of May, 2025. The key went in first, driven with an 18-pound sledge, 6 blows, and the sound of it changed on the 5th blow the way a wedge does when it stops traveling and starts working. The nut came back against that polished patch of steel and sat down in it like it had been cast there, which in a way it had 112 years of the same load in the same place. They ran a chain from the oval eye at the far end of the handle to a 60-ton hollow ram anchored into the pit wall, and the chain lay in the oval exactly along its long axis, pulling the way the eye had been stretched, which was the third thing on the list and the last of the 3 to prove itself. It did not move on the first try, or the second, or the third. They put 4 hours of low heat into the boss of the nut on the morning of the 20th, backed off, came at it again, and on the 4th pull, with 9 men in the pit and most of a village standing on the road above the tail race where they could see nothing at all. The nut turned 11 degrees, and everybody in the pit heard it. After 11 degrees, it went the rest of the way in 40 minutes. The runner came off the shaft on the 22nd of May. The thread underneath it was perfect. The 3 surviving corners of the nut are still 3 corners, and the flats it was gripped by are unmarked. Unit 2 came back online at Rumapata on the 9th of June, 2025, and the rented diesel sets went back down the mountain empty in July. That is not the end of it, and this is the part Wade Toiver did not see coming. There are 3 more machines in the Andes off the same 1913 print, 2 in Bolivia and 1 in northern Chile, and every one of them has a 34-inch nut on it, and not one of them has a tool. Crate 6111 has been on a truck ever since. By March of 2026, that wrench had opened 7 nuts in 3 countries, and it now travels with a logbook and a schedule and 2 hardened keys, the one Wade made in Ohio out of a piece of 4140 in a day, and a spare machine shop in Oruro cut from the first one. A collector in the United States has offered $186,000 for it to hang it in a room. The utility that owns it has declined twice. Their position, translated, is that the tool is on a schedule. So here is where all of it lands. In a tent in Ohio, on a wet afternoon in April, a room full of people who work with their hands looked at the single most valuable thing in the sale and read it correctly in every respect but one. They were right that it was too heavy to move. Right that it was worth less than the cost of cutting it up. Right that nothing they owned had a nut on it 34 inches across. The one thing they got wrong was the slot. Somebody's ruined it, they said, and they laughed, and the price came down and down until a millwright who had spent 34 years around machines that come apart exactly once a generation put his hand in the jaw and bid $75. That slot is the only reason a nut in the Andes ever moved. It is the reason 31,000 people came off diesel. It is the difference between the tool that works and the beautiful one on the wall, and you cannot see it from across a tent, and you can see it in about 4 seconds if you walk over.